Human Tech, a podcast about the intersection between humans and technology. My name is Guthrie. I am here with Susan. Hi, Susan.
Hello, Guthrie.
And we also have today a very special guest, Eric Olive, who's the founder and principal of UI UX Training. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Guthrie. Hello, Susan.
Hey.
So
yeah.
It's another one of Susan's contacts.
I know. This is called Susan Can't Resist Having Her Favorite People on the show. Well, it's interesting, though, Guthrie, because some of the people that come on, we've known for a brief time, or recently we had Nick Fine on, and I don't think we had even talked to him until the podcast episode recording. But Eric Olive is one of the friends who I've known for a long time. And Eric, I don't even know. Do you know how we've...
Yes, I do
maybe
remember.
We don't want to give the year.
Yeah, we might not.
Too revealing. But how did we first meet? And it was a long time ago.
It was 2017, right?
There you go, right?
Yeah, right.
So Susan and I first met when I was a staff, a very green UXer on staff at an insurance carrier, and Susan trained me and my colleagues. And if it weren't for Susan Guthrie, I would not be the fabulous UX specialist that you see before you today.
Oh, high praise.
Yeah.
So
and then through the years we worked on some projects together.
Yes.
And some usability, user experience projects. And Eric and I Eric taught some courses that has taught, he still teaches, and has taught some courses that I worked on putting together. And Eric and I have had many, many conversations about the challenge of being a consultant in this industry. And we're not going to go there, because we could definitely take up like 5 episodes ranting about why UX consulting is so hard, and why clients often don't make decisions that are best for themselves and their products and their services. Although we'll kind of get into that, because I think we're going to talk about decisions. Yeah. But that is a favorite topic of Eric and I. Now, Eric, as we get into today, because I think today we're going to talk about probably a bunch of stuff having to do with decisions, having to do with trust, having to do with incentives, and so on. But I want to start this by just a thought I had while we were preparing for it, and Guthrie, you can chime in too. So Eric is Guthrie, as you may or may not know, because I know Eric a lot longer and better than you do, I think. Eric is a very organized person, and he likes to be, have all, I guess the phrase is, all his ducks in a row, and, be very prepared, which is something I've always appreciated about him. And interestingly, when we were emailing back and forth about the podcast, he sent me an outline of, we could talk about this and then this and then this, and, in very, very Eric Olive fashion, and very, one could say, a very normal thing to do, right? But what struck me when he did that was that, because I tend to do the same thing. I have lists, I organize things. And Guthrie knows, if I'm teaching, when we're teaching a workshop together, for instance, or giving a presentation, I definitely have everything, organized, and I'll have times. We're going to do this exercise. It's going to take this much time. Then we're going to talk about this much time. In fact, I think sometimes I drive Guthrie crazy with that. But when you sent me the outline for the podcast episode, my reaction, Eric, was, "Oh, no. We don't have an outline for this." And then it was like, wait a minute. Why don't we? Like, why do I think that? Like, what is that division in my mind that there are some things we have an outline for and some things we don't? And I have some ideas about this, but I don't know if either of you want to chime in before I give my idea. Guthrie, you have anything to say on that?
Well, I think part of it has to do with with habits and expectations. I mean, how many times have you done this podcast?
That's a good question. How many have we done? We have them numbered, so we must know.
And
yeah, it's like 60 something
and
or
I think,
70 something.
I mean, honestly, I just think it has to. I wish there's a fun, cool answer that I think you're fishing for. And
I'm
then
not fishing for anything.
I think there's
just
the
have
more
my
boring
idea.
answer that's just less interesting that I think is
Well,
actually happening.
Wait a minute. I want to hear both of this.
Okay, well, the cool, I guess, like sexier answer is basically that something about how we put together tasks in our head, and how this is like a free-flowing conversation that's like a different pathway, and so you don't you're not treating it like something you have to do, but yet you're just talking, and so it wouldn't make sense to organize your ideas sequentially because it's not that formal. I think the perhaps more realistic answer is that you very much like to feel. I mean, we all do. We, as in humans. So when I say you, I don't mean the literal you, but the human you.
Yeah.
People like to be in charge. And so if there's a structure, especially if it's not one that you came up with, you then feel scared because it's unknown. There are perhaps things that you are not an expert in that you may look bad on the podcast. And so you inherently don't want to do you don't want to go out of your comfort zone, or not be in control. And so you say, oh no, I'm just going to do what I want, as opposed to let's follow an outline that someone else has created.
Oh, that's it. So we have theory A, which is I approach it differently because I'm thinking as a conversation, not a workshop or a presentation, and conversations follow different pathways. Or theory B, which is I'm a control freak, and so I didn't want to follow someone else's outline.
But in the best way.
But in a nice way. All right. And Eric, do you have any theories you want to?
I do actually. I was leaning toward the pathways, because as a behavioral scientist, because you are a behavioral scientist, I was wondering if you were leaning toward, we use different parts of our brain. You've talked about this on the podcast and with me, different parts of our brain for different activities. So do we somehow cognitively, I guess, associate podcasts or something we've done, as Guthrie said, almost a habit many times, with a different part of our brain, and somehow think about it differently than we do something that we might perceive as more formal, which I think, Guthrie, is what you were saying for the pathways explanation. Right.
Yeah, I don't know if I quite nailed it, but there's like a cool, sexy answer that has to do with, just our mental model of work versus play. I mean, there's a fun, sexy answer in there.
Right, and I was wondering. I guess I wasn't necessarily thinking it would be a fun, sexy answer, though it could be. But I was just wondering if, asking both of you, if in terms of the neuroscience, if that's the case. I don't think I know the answer off the top of my head, but Susan, you've definitely on the podcast said things like, we do, and to me, we do certain activity. We conceive of things differently. Like we use a different part of our brain when we type than when we write by hand. And I was wondering, could there be something like that going on? But I don't actually know.
Yeah. So those are all interesting ideas. I don't have an answer.
Susan, do you know anything about mental habits?
Yes.
Well, I'm thinking about, okay, so if we're going down not the control road, but down the other road.
Yeah.
We have habits like when we brush our teeth. But but when we, for example, when you play Scrabble, I'm assuming everyone has played Scrabble. You have like the letters.
Yeah.
And so it's a thinking task, right? But I feel like there are like mental habits you fall into where you kind of like, okay, I need to solve a problem, which is how do I get, the most, the best word using the letters that I have. And so you kind of, so you start by just looking at it and seeing if anything pops out, and then you move some letters around, and then you like look on the board for triple
So there's
word
like
scores.
strategies.
Yeah. So well, and you do it. You're doing it unconsciously. You have a habit of how to go about mentally solving this problem. And I think we probably do that in a lot of different ways. And so when we do like different mental things. Now, I don't know if habits work the same way as, salivating at a steak. I guess that's Pavlovian, but or brushing our teeth, after we floss. Like,
yeah, so you're saying our mental habits the same?
Yes, I don't know. I'm asking.
I think they probably are, but I think in this case an interesting thing happened when I thought about it. So I think it's probably all a little bit of everything you guys are saying. Definitely, I'm a control freak. Although,
yeah, my money's still on that one.
Although I do want to say, maybe that's really true. Of that's the reason why I had that reaction. But part of it was the conversation idea. I mean, we've set these up to be conversational, and interestingly, I find that very challenging, and it makes me feel. So I kind of like doing it because it's different, and I'm hoping that our audience likes listening to conversations and not just planned interviews. But I also know that it makes it's a little scary for me, and it makes me feel a little vulnerable, to get on the air. And I mean, luckily we're not live, so if we totally botch it, we don't have to post it. But
you don't like schmoozing. I love to schmooze.
No, I don't like schmoozing.
Schmoozing's great.
I'm an introvert. And so this gets at something, actually, Eric, that you mentioned right before we started recording, which is the idea of psychological safety. Because doing these as a conversation and not necessarily following an outline actually messes with my feeling of psychological safety.
Interesting.
So it makes me feel, and so I'm kind of, in one way, it's like avoidance, and I'm attracted to it, to the idea of challenging myself and doing something that I don't usually like to do. On the other hand, it's a little scary, and I'd rather avoid it. So, anyway, I that's a good way to waste 10 minutes just talking about my reaction to the outline.
The control freak thing is interesting, though, because of course it's a loaded term, but one way to think about control freak is not necessarily, because people tend to think, it means that the person wants to control everything and everyone around them, which is not what you said explicitly, but that's what it tends to imply. But another way of thinking about being control freak is just our innate, desire to alleviate any uncertainty, right? Our brains don't like uncertainty, right? May Kahneman and Dvorsky and Robin Hogarth and John Medina, the molecular biologist. I mean, lots has been written about this, right? So we know that the brain does not like uncertainty. And that's why I believe Kahneman talks about the lazy brain, like doesn't like that, right? So availability bias, I'm going to latch onto this answer because I believe it's physiological. Like we don't tolerate uncertainty well. And I've always kind of wondered if the control freak phenomenon is part of that, not only about wanting to be like, I've got everything together, but wanting to combat that sense of uncertainty that we all face on a variety of fronts.
Yeah. So now I feel I should, we're doing therapy on me. Which I probably need. Okay. So one of the things that we had on our loose outline / list was to talk about psychological safety, but maybe we should back up and get into that in a different way. So, I mean, your background, Eric, is very much in, it's very similar to my background, actually, in that, you started off doing usability work and then kind of broadened it a little bit to user experience work, if anyone wants to define the difference between those, which we won't go into right now. And then you really started delving even more into behavioral science, and specifically the area of behavioral science that you've been working in the last couple of years, especially is in the area of the research on decisions, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, and you had commented about the relation about trust, and Guthrie and I did a podcast recently on trust, the culture of trust, and he's been doing a lot of blog posts about trust. So, what do you see as this? You had mentioned about the relationship between trust and psychological safety.
Yes, I thought it was interesting. So there's a professor at Harvard whose name is Amy Edmondson, and she's done quite a bit of work. And Michael Roberto, formerly of Harvard, now at Bryant University, also cites her work, but basically on psychological safety. So the idea of creating an environment of psychological safety, stimulates collective problem solving. So Edmondson says psychological safety is the shared belief that a group is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And so I believe, Guthrie, that coincides pretty closely with what you were calling, a culture of trust. And so that includes the boss. And you said this, as I recall, quite explicitly in the podcast, Guthrie, that, the boss has to be accountable. The boss has to admit that he or she makes errors. The boss has to acknowledge her own fallibility and prior errors as a means of encouraging people to take interpersonal risks of their own. So, lead by example. So we could call it a culture of trust, or we could call it psychological safety. You had made a distinction between those two, Guthrie, and I don't think we need to go back into that. But I think that I believe the idea is essentially the same. The people in an organization need to feel that they can take, risks in terms of, the work and projects they take on, and, with other people, that they can feel secure in the sense, I can take this risk, I can ask for help, I can fail, and it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. So it's an interesting, then really you have these two opposite things, right? Risk and safety.
Yes, but yet they're contingent according to Edmondson's work.
You're not gonna. So if there's not if you do something, and it will come back to negatively affect you, okay?
So you're not safe
in an unfair way. Then
right.
Okay.
Then so if you think about it this way, let's say I work for some fancy lab, and it basically says, hey, look, go and try to hit home runs and think outside the box, right? Take risks, take chances. Now, if you fail and you take, that's kind of dependent on the size of your risk. If you spend all of the resources on one thing and it doesn't work out, you're probably going to be held accountable. But like if you're smart with your risk, we'll be like, it failed and that's okay, blah blah blah. But if for example, there's not a culture of trust, and if you do anything that's even remotely risk taking, even a little bit, and it doesn't work, then the person outside the norm then gets blamed for like the failure of the entire project. So right. the I guess the kind of game theory, though it's not game theory because we're talking about humans, but then what is more likely than not going to happen is that most people will just keep their head down, do what they're supposed to do, even if that's not not what's written down is what they're supposed to do, but what the norms are in the kind of group behavior that they're working in, and then they'll just do that and do what everyone else does, and not take any risks, because then if it goes wrong, well, you can't blame me because I didn't do anything. I just did what so and so told me to do.
That I think that's exactly right. So, yeah. And I have an anecdote, if you guys will indulge me, but yes. Let me just say this first. Actually, I have a bunch, but I'll just do one, I guess. But what's interesting is, in perhaps in an unexpected way at first glance, right, risk and trust are actually connected. Whereas you would initially think, oh, well, taking risks is. I mean, if you take risk, it's not safe. So I'm sorry, risks and safety, right? Risks and psychological safety. You say, oh, I take a risk, it's not safe, right? It's safer to not take. And you're quite right, Guthrie. Everything you said is exactly right. If people don't feel supported and that they can't. So it's kind of interesting because we tend to, as you said, Susan, we tend to think of them as the opposite. But I have an anecdote that I think really drives the point home of the aversion to risk taking. So I was doing work, this was several years ago, for in the kind of life sciences biotech space, and they wanted to design a fairly sophisticated intranet. It was kind of fun, and so I said, just go wild. I said, are you sure? They said, absolutely, just go wild, just really. And so I did it. I hired a subcontractor to help me. We're doing all stuff. I presented the designs. They said, oh no, that's way too out there. We can't do that. And this was after I had followed up repeatedly and said, are you sure that you really want to go to the extreme? And so they thought they did, but they really didn't. And just a quick follow-up on that, when I've worked with clients and have a long-standing relationship with them, I play a little game. And as you both know, one way to present designs is to give them three options, right? It's a fairly common approach. Here are three options. So I would typically in those situations say, here's option A, here's option A, very similar to what they had. Here's option B, a little bit different, a little bit of a stretch, and here's the real stretch, really creative idea. And I would write on a Post-it note before I presented which one I thought they were going to choose. And I put it face down. And
now this was based on. Were you writing that based on this particular client, or is this? Do you write the same thing on the card?
It was per individual project,
okay.
But it often was the same, and I was right every time. And usually and I'd like to tell you it's because I'm this amazingly clairvoyant guy, but that's not the reason.
Psychic ability.
The reason is that people are in this respect fairly predictable. They want to do something a little different, but so A is the safe option, B is just a little bit different, and C is the stretch. Let's do something really not radical, but really very different. Clients inevitably chose B. I would say 80% of the time. So I was almost always right. And so now, again, you can only do this when you have a long-standing relationship with the client. You know them well. They'll take it the right way. You don't do this on your first or second engagement, of course. But the point is that people, even and some of these were startups, I might add. And some of them were like internal, like actual startups. Some were kind of internal startups, if you know what I mean. And it didn't, or big, it didn't matter, you guys. It honestly, the size, the domain, the age of the people.
None of that mattered.
Now, granted, this is anecdotal. I don't have stats. I didn't do this 6,000 times, but I thought that was very interesting. Gender. I mean, it just, as far as I could tell, it did not matter.
Well, one of the more interesting, at least anecdotally again, things that I've seen is, there are a lot of companies, organizations that, I guess their self-identity is that they take risks and they make a safe environment. And when you actually go and kind of like hang out in the environment, everyone is just as conservative as possible. And they don't want to rock the boat and they don't want to stand out because oftentimes in those cultures, there's a lot of instability and who's boss. The bosses are moving around all the time. If you think of like a really, really, really boring company, like some sort of, like insurance actuary, something, right? So on one hand, they're not trying to rock the boat at all. And that's fine. They're kind of, they're trying to hit singles, so what's a big risk to them is like a very small risk to maybe a tech company. But but oftentimes in those companies, and I'm not saying that the corporate structure is great, but you have people who have been working together for 20 years and it's older and the bosses are the same. And so in some ways there's more trust. So it can go both ways, but one of the things that's funny is that just because a company says that they promote trust and that they're that they want their employees to take risks, it often doesn't happen, because then if the employees take risks and it doesn't work, then those employees often get blamed and fired or moved or passed up.
Right. The two responses to that. One is, I think I hear you saying, essentially, it's not true. The leaders are, and they may even believe it in their minds. I do not think that they are being dishonest in most cases.
No. Yeah, they totally, they believe it all.
They believe it, but it's actually not true because, even the COO, right, or the CIO couldn't totally, the number two, number three, depending how you're structured, doesn't necessarily control the entire culture, right? But at the same time, I would. So that's one reason. And as far as your example of like an insurance company, and I used to work for an insurance company, so I know a little bit about this. Even in a place like that, even though there are people who work together for a long time, and I've worked at some other places too, you're right. Certainly there are trusting relationships, but at the same time, as you well know, if there is any mistrust, it can become calcified. So if there's like, let's say you have a good relationship with the people on your team and maybe people on the other team in a different department you work closely with, but we've always had trouble with, so departments A and B get along really well together, let's pretend. But department C, they're a little difficult. Even, if those guys have turnover, that mistrust can become calcified. And so I don't think and I don't think this is exactly what you were saying, but just to extend, I don't think that the duration of having people there for a long time necessarily results in more trust. If there's any history of one, problems between departments or between teams, or two, as you said, the person takes a risk and fails and then gets hammered. So I'm not sure duration is necessarily going to help.
Oh, yeah. So I mean, and in like a one little paragraph summary, basically to have a culture of trust, you need punishment, and everyone in the group has to be held to the same standards. And so oftentimes, whether it's a tech company or insurance company, if the people above are not, are not able to be criticized and kind of turn into these godlike figures where I feel like you get a meeting with them, it's a really big deal, and like everyone just like sucks up to them all the time, which I mean is the case in most companies, then yeah, you're not going to have, it's not a culture of trust because not everyone is, some people are above the law, so to speak. But
right, and I think that's exactly what, to circle back to where we started with psychological safety, that is what Amy Edmondson, the Harvard professor, is arguing, and I thought that's exactly what you were saying in the last episode.
Yes.
I do have there are some suggestions in the literature for how to, mitigate this problem, maybe not eliminate it, but mitigate this issue. Would you guys like me to just briefly list some of those ideas?
Go for it.
So there's a book called Why Great Leaders Don't Take Yes for an Answer, by Michael Roberto, who is a professor who studies decision science, and he talks about role play. So, just putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And he cites a very famous example. I suspect you guys have heard of it. Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, when they made the big decision, to move, from memory to chips, to producing the chips, he and a colleague sat around and said, what if somebody came in, if the board fired us and somebody new came in, what would that person do? Not what should they do, but what would they do, or what could they do? And by just engaging in that, relatively straightforward mental simulation, they changed the entire direction of the business, and Intel thrived. Because when they were having that discussion, the business of, just computer memory was, the profit margins were declining.
Well, that's so funny because I feel like if you talk to anyone who's in a company, you're like, hey, so how's company X to work for? Well, blah, blah, blah. Well, what's the problem? And like everyone knows what the problem is, and they probably even have solutions. And so, but like no one actually would do anything about it. It's not their job.
Right. So,
but if you just say, so like what should, if someone just came in and like was a new CEO, what should they do? Oh, you should just do X and X and X, and it would fix all the problems.
Or what could they do?
Yeah.
What sometimes in the literature you'll see that, and I know this is a minor distinction, but what could or would you do? The idea is to kind of open it up, so not to be so prescriptive, right? But what could you do? What's possible? I mean, within reason,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, Intel should have changed and started making, what would then have been a new thing like Teslas or something. But so role play is one. Another one is mental simulation. And in this book, Michael Roberto cites the work of Gary Klein. And I'm pretty sure, Susan, that you've read some of Klein's work. Gary Klein is a psychologist who's just done some fascinating work on pattern recognition. I'll skip the history on that, but just to mention Herbert Simon was a very famous social scientist who was kind of the groundbreaker on that. But Klein's work is really interesting. So what he basically has said is that he's done studies on firefighters and ICU nurses, basically people with deep experience and expertise in a specific area. And what those people do is they actually do not weigh various options in a situation because they don't have time. Instead, they play out one scenario in their mind, like as things are happening. Like if there's a problem in the ICU, with an infant, if there's a fire, like they're literally standing there fighting the fire, and they determine if it's likely to succeed, and if it is likely, they take action. If not, they go to the next alternative. The reason they can do this mental simulation and do it so fast is because they have deep experience. So Klein refers to that as intuition. And I thought it is very interesting because there are a lot of misconceptions about intuition, but you can only do it based on deep experience. So the bottom line is intuition is essentially pattern recognition based on your deep experience. So a firefighter cannot do it in a hospital, right? And the ICU nurse can't do it while fighting a fire. And so role play is number one, this mental simulation based on intuition, which is pattern recognition, is number two. The third one, or a third solution, is conceptual models. So leaders in an organization can identify, a specific conceptual model and then assign staff to use different lenses. So the idea is each person goes off and, kind of examines the problem, tries to find stuff out from a different point of view, and then they come back together instead of all sitting in a room, right, and getting into the groupthink problem, which we're all well familiar with. So that's not a radical idea, but at the same time, if you think about how problem solving often happens in organizations, a lot of times you will have a bunch of people in a room. We've all been in those situations. And it's not that can't work, but you get back to groupthink, you get back to some of the stuff we were just talking about, psychological safety. What if I'm in the room with the boss? Then I have an idea, but I'm not sure the boss is receptive, or my boss's boss is there, or it's another team and I don't know them well, all those kinds of things.
Well, it's tough, because let's say that there's a boss who's in charge of toasters, and
right,
you have an idea of how to make the toasters better. Well, by saying your idea, you are implicitly implying that they are not doing the best job they could with the toasters.
Very good point.
And
very good.
But that's the truth. If they were doing a perfect job with toasters, you wouldn't need to do anything, and every organization would be perfect.
Right. A lot of it does come back to that psychological safety and trust. That's why I was fascinated by the episode. I listen to just about every episode you guys do, and I'm not just saying that, I really do. And this one really struck me, the culture of trust, because I thought, oh wow, So just to wrap up here, so role play is number one, mental simulation, based on intuition is number two, conceptual models number three, get going off on your own, to avoid some of what you just said, Guthrie, and four is just point counterpoint, right? So devil's advocate, and just kind of divide people into production teams and a product team, and see if you can, actually you want to engender conflict. Another thing that Gary Klein talks about, a devil's advocate, is just seek out the person in your organization with whom you often disagree. I used to do this all the time. There's a person on my team. We had respect for each other, but we didn't like each other. We just didn't.
Was that me?
Yeah, Susan, it was you.
Was it me, Eric?
This was at the insurance carrier. That's all I'll say. So anyway,
wait a minute. Did the two of you know that you respected each other and didn't like each other?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
this was all out in the open.
Well, as out in the open as it can be, in that kind of environment. But we would consult each other from time to time, and we usually did. We disagreed about a lot of stuff, but the person was very talented, worked very hard, had a different background than I did. So that person's knowledge was valuable. The fact that we weren't going to become best chums didn't mean that we couldn't learn from each other. So was there tension sometimes? Absolutely. But that at least, there are probably many examples when I have not done this, sought out someone else's opinion, knowing that they're going to disagree. I probably should do it more, but I do feel good about the fact that I did that over a period of about 5 years with this individual.
It was probably helpful that you actually you respected them but didn't like them, because I think, if you, me, and this is just my own psychology at work, if I like someone, then I don't want to have conflict with them.
Right.
I don't want to disagree with them. I'll want them to feel that they know I appreciate them, and all that will get involved. So I'm less likely to, go to them and listen to their idea, and even, and choose whether to use some of it or not, because I'll feel like, I have to agree with them, or I'll hurt the relationship. Right. So it's probably really useful to do that with someone that, you respect, but it's not that important to you if they think you're being stupid.
Emotionally. That's a very good point.
Right. It's like, so I'm going to argue with him, and he won't like me again, but that's all right, because I don't really like him. And
if he already doesn't like me.
Yeah, he already doesn't like me, so no big deal.
How much worse can that's a very good point. That's a very
and Guthrie, I'm wondering about, because we just posted one of Guthrie's videos that I actually want to do a whole podcast episode on, so I don't want to talk about it too much here. But I'm wondering too if the status quo bias gets in the way too. I was thinking about when Eric, you were talking about how you need to like have people go out and bring back information, and rather than just sitting in the room to solve a problem.
Just explore.
And I think it's so. I think we have, these ways of working and interacting in a group that just become so ingrained. We're gonna, I'm hoping pretty soon we're gonna interview Kevin Hoffman, who wrote the book called Meeting Design, and we're going to talk about meetings and how you do them. But I'm just struck with how, there's just this usual way we go about solving problems, and we don't change. And Guthrie, I'm thinking about, we've been in meetings with clients where, we're talking about some pretty big stuff, pretty big changes, right, to their products or services. And it's like we're sitting in a room, and, one person in the room maybe has been out in the field.
Oh,
and everyone else in the room hasn't been out in the field for, maybe a long time, or or whatever. And it's like, we shouldn't. Should we really be making these decisions that are going to have such a big impact without going out and, talking to people and interviewing? And this is why, in the field of UX, right? Why you have to do user testing. You can't just sit in the room.
That's
right. And go through the design. But the status quo.
Big problem.
If the status quo is, no, we just get together and we talk about it and make decisions, then you're not going to do something different.
But here's the interesting thing.
What?
So, with this particular company, they had.
That you think I have in mind?
Yes.
Okay.
They
And I don't know if we're thinking about the same company.
We're probably thinking about different companies. I see. But there was, one of the other things I was going to say is, sometimes corporate leadership knows this. If you have a good exec and you can get top-down approval, some of the best ways to break down these barriers is to bring in someone from the outside to say the things to the execs that other people in the company perhaps are scared to say. To be like, hey, you might have been thinking about user testing. I encourage you to do this. I think you have to do this. The way you set this up over here is stupid. The way you've set this up over here is fine. Like, just like neutral ways that really then allow, I feel. So if you have like that outsider in the room who says it, then the person who actually works at the company, who maybe has never said anything out of, fear, then all of a sudden they can, and the big exec asks the outsider, what do you think about X? The outsider can say the truth in a non-judgmental, positive way. The big exec who has being told that, well, you could have maybe done this better. Not that it's your fault personally, but whoever you are in charge of could have done a better job with this. And the exec takes it and says, oh, that's a good point. It then empowers, once you've all of a sudden developed a culture of trust, and then it empowers, the VP who's in the room, who has for the last 7 years hasn't said anything because
or has been saying the same thing and getting nowhere.
Yes, exactly.
It happens a lot.
Then says, hey, well, if you're thinking about doing this, why don't we do X, right? And then the exec's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But like without that outside person to almost facilitate the insulting of the bigwig. Or insulting, not on a personal level, but on a professional level.
Educating.
No, I really do think it's not educating. It's saying that you are not infallible. That you and your department
you've missed something important,
have
or
missed important things. And the exec is like, oh, I hear that, and I accept that as a good idea. And I will endeavor, I, as being in charge of the team, I/we will endeavor to do a better job. It then empowers other people who have great ideas about how to do a better job to then open up.
To speak up.
Yeah.
Yes. And
it's one of the great things. I mean, it's true. And it's one of the reasons for bringing in a consultant. Although you also then have to think that the people who do bring in consultants, whether they are consciously aware of it or not, are essentially saying, yeah, go ahead. Let's find out what we've missed or where our weak points are. I mean, rarely, this happens sometimes, but I think most of the time, well, I don't know. I think most of the time people bring in a consultant to tell them what the problem is or what they've missed or what they could do quite differently. They rarely bring someone in to just bless the direction that, they know there's a high probability the consultant is going to say, nah, you missed something here. So that means that they're on some level, somebody's open to be vulnerable in that way.
I think that's true. I would add often, not always, but often, there is a challenge, and this has come up quite a bit when I've taught over the past several years, is sometimes, and this is true when somebody proposes a change internally or externally as consultant, as you and I are, Susan. So let's say, Susan, you go in there and the VP of marketing or the VP of customer experience hired you, right? So there's a lot of UX in there, one hopes, right? Because they're so closely tied. And you make these recommendations and the VP says, oh, yeah, I agree with that. Let's do that. And all the people in the middle, the directors and the managers nod their heads, yes, yes, and then nothing happens.
Yeah.
What I have found pretty consistently in the 18 years I've been doing this work is that there can be a great deal of resistance in the middle. And there's so much talk in UX about getting buy-in at the executive level, which is critical. I think we'd all agree with that. But one of the things I've noticed, particularly in teaching, I've had, the students come to me and say, I'm the director of UX. I'm in the middle, and I want this changed. And I got people below me who are all in, and I got the executives who are all in. My problem, Eric, is that my peers, the other directors, are fighting me tooth and nail. I've seen this probably 100 times. And so people have asked me, well, what's the solution? And I said, well, That's not easy, but one thing I've encouraged is, I've encouraged people to move away from like World Usability Day, and I know that's very popular, but I feel like you're kind of preaching to the choir, and instead, I've encouraged people to do things like latch onto something that already exists. If there's a customer experience day, if there's a project that's led by marketing or something that's related but not core UX, latch onto those people, get their buy-in. And that's not super easy, but I think it's better than just standing up and saying UX is great, UX is great, or whatever your field. If you do something different, like you want to do a different kind of development, you say this particular model we're using isn't working, or we need to adjust our agile process, right? It doesn't have to be UX, but I think just kind of standing up and saying we need to do this doesn't work. And hiring a consultant does help, but then you've got to implement. And of course, that's the hard part. And so I really think if you can latch on to another area, if you can establish, we're back to psychological safety and trust. If you can establish that trust and go there, then it's going to spread, because where I've consistently seen resistance, and this happened fairly recently yet again, is in the middle. What I think of as the middle, and I mean by that directors and managers, the middle management, because they're busy, they're stressed, and they have ownership of their little area. And there's fear there, and there's aversion, there's risk aversion, right? So that's, again, making people feel psychologically safe. It's not easy.
To tie this, I think this ties in perfectly with where we started. If you are held accountable for thing X, and person A comes to you and says, "Hey, change, here's the podcast schedule," you are very scared to accept that, because you want the control, because ultimately you are responsible for thing X. And so if the top management comes with their consultant and talks to the middle manager and says, "Hey, we're going this way, and by the way, if it doesn't work, we're going to blame you in 6 months." And there's not, and the executive who's perhaps pushing it says, "Hey, if it doesn't work, don't worry, I won't blame you. I'll take all," when do they say, "I'll take all the blame, just implement this the best you can,
right,
and you won't get in trouble, regardless." I don't think that's, it's never communicated that way, but I think the underlying appreciation is, well, if our, numbers go down for our, the metric that you are ultimately judged on, it's your fault. It would make all the sense in the world that they'd be resistant when an outsider to them shows up and says, "Hey, do things this way," and then they are no longer perhaps in control of the ultimate outcome that they will then be judged on.
This reminds me of many years ago. I was doing some work for a company that made at that point, basically made and sold clothing, online retailer, an early one. And they had I was getting a tour of their distribution center where, they orders came in and these people would go find the items, right, and put the order together, or actually it was automated. So the right items would come to them and they would put it in a box and send it out. And they had just implemented a new software for the line, for the automation, in which the people who are doing the packing could adjust the software on the fly to change the kind of orders they got, the speed with which orders were coming. So, for instance, you could get one order that has 10 things in it, right? And it's going to take you a while to pack that all up. And so maybe you do a few orders like that in an hour, versus you get orders that just have one thing in them, and you can pack that up really fast. And normally there would some program is controlling all that, or one person is controlling all that. And what they did was they gave control to each person. So each person could go in and adjust the automation and say essentially today or right now, I'd like to do, big orders, or I'd like to do small orders, or the orders are coming too fast, or the orders are coming too slowly to me. And at first, when they implemented this, is like people were just like, I'm not changing it. I'm not going to do this. But then they experimented. They were encouraged to just try it a little bit. And, people and this place had probably some of the highest culture of trust scores that any company I've seen would have. So it actually became a big hit to go and, dial it and try things out and know that at the end of the day, you weren't going to get in trouble because, you had changed it this way or changed it that way.
So they were able to do it because they had such a high, an authentic sense of psychological safety and, as you said, high scores in culture of trust.
And I think also because it wasn't a permanent change,
Right.
I didn't have to decide from here on out, I could just kind of fiddle with it, and try this way and try that way and try this way. And I think that sense of experimentation, that it's okay to experiment.
But also, if it doesn't work, you can just run back to your safety hole.
You can just say, I'm going to set the dials exactly the way I had them before because I don't know what the heck's going on.
Oh, right. That's a very good point. Right. And again, it's that, risk aversion and that sense of uncertainty that our brains don't feel comfortable with. That's very interesting. That's a very interesting.
All right. So we should do a check in here at the outline and see. What haven't we talked about?
Well, there's one thing I wondered about if we have just a few minutes to talk about choice architecture.
Yeah.
That's something that Guthrie mentioned at the end of the episode about the culture of trust. Yeah. And what I'm curious about is what you two were just talking about. Is there a way to use choice architecture in an organization, in a work environment, to make it easier for people to take risks? And here's why I asked that, because I've read, some of the choice architecture literature, and it sounds like you have too, Guthrie. And a lot of the examples are, very much about, like at Google, for example, they give people dessert plates with just a bite size, like 2 bites, instead of people, like, oh, here, take as much as you want, and you have to go back in line to get it again. They're trying to encourage healthier eating, right? Smaller plates. We're familiar with this. Another one is at the gas pump. The nozzles are different sizes. So you can't put diesel. You literally can't put a diesel pump into your regular car. That kind of thing. And so a lot of the examples I've seen of choice architecture, like in the books like Nudge, by Thaler and Sunstein, and that's a very well-known book, and in all kinds of other places, have been a little bit more on the individual behavior level, preventing mistakes, and that's all important and interesting. I haven't encountered as much about how could you use choice architecture, which is just as the book says, just nudging people, right, just a little bit. And Susan, this is right up your alley as a behavioral scientist. Can we use that same idea of choice architecture to nudge people to take more risks? I presumably based on the assumption that there is, this culture of trust, this sense of psychological safety. And I started to think about it, but I haven't, to be honest, come up with any like really concrete, solutions or techniques. And I was wondering if you two have thought about choice architecture in this context of work and getting people to take a risk and work differently and perhaps more creatively.
Yeah, sure. So I think of choice architecture not as a nudge, but as a philosophy. So nudges, the Richard Thaler nudges, are just it's one it's one small piece of choice architecture, but you can use choice architecture. Choice architecture to me and maybe no one else agrees with me, but to me, it's a way of thinking, which is I want people to do X. And so I'm going to look at the decisions they make, and I'm going to set up those decision trees in such a way to encourage them to take this path. And so whether that's I want them to, traditionally it's like I want end consumer to eat less, so I will use small servings, so they have to make more, decision points, blah, blah, blah. But there's no reason that you can't do it on a much, much larger and grandiose scale. And in fact, I think people are using choice architecture. And I mean, like if whenever you set up the organization of your company, I think you're setting up, you wouldn't call it choice architecture, but how does the IT department work? When someone has a problem with their computer, what do they do, and who do they talk to, and all those things. There is a choice architecture there, in my opinion. It's just not a thought about choice architecture. It's like
it's
a
not
naturally
conscious.
It's like a naturally occurring.
Yeah. It's the environment, and I guess just for a sec, that I guess nudging people's behavior, like trying to modify the environment. But I do like the way you're thinking about choice architecture, something broader. But I believe the idea is, how can we tweak the environment rather than coming in and saying we're going to make this radical change. But I think I take your point though, because if someone's going to tweak that environment, that would probably be conscious. But you're saying that this just choice architecture exists whether we're aware of it or not. Is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. But okay, so let's now move towards, we want people to take more risks, and how can we use the architecture of choice to encourage people to take more risks? Okay. So, yes. It would depend on the specific context, but I'll try and do it with broad strokes. So if you want people to take more risk, then what they need to do is they need to feel as if they will be rewarded for taking risks, that taking risks will benefit them, okay, in some way, and won't negatively affect them. So there's a couple ways to do this. The simplest way, okay, this is not simple whatsoever. The first way that came up, that came to mind, if you wanted to go all in, okay, if you wanted to go all in, whenever you are part of your team, you come up with we can do things path A, path B, path C, right? And, so maybe that's like we have the menu on the left and we have the menu on the right and we have the menu on the top, something like that. And that's a really dumb example. But there are three ways we can do this. And then what the team can do together is collectively vote on what is the safe approach, what is the, and I would do it on like a, 0 to 2 scale, perhaps, where 1 is just regular middle of the road, 0.5 is safe, 1.5 is like more risky, and so together the team would rate individual proposals, or you could rate anything, how you respond to an email if you really wanted to, right? Well, we could go for the fences and try to get the sale right now, or we could play things slow and safe, whatever it is. You could just weight everything based on risk, and then each employee would have then a risk profile. How much risk do they take at work versus how safe they are? And you could make compensation based on risk taking. So people who take more, who come up with and implement more risky behaviors are compensated higher. It's part of your pay structure. And so middle managers would, the middle managers whose teams have like the highest, total risk, per person would get paid more. So at the metrics of what are the middle managers judged on is risk taking. I mean, so often, I find, and it happens in most people, they say, hey, so at the end of the year, here's your, we want this to be a positive environment, and we want people to do this and do that, do this. And it's like, well, at the end of the year, the only thing that you're judged on is like, what are like the scores of X, or how many widgets do you ship? And if that's the only thing that matters, that's the only thing that managers are going to try and focus on. So, so that's like one crazy out in the sky way to do it.
Susan, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it does a couple things. It also makes people just more aware of risk, of the concept of risk, because I think for a lot of people, they don't necessarily think that way. They're not consciously thinking of, so what's the safe option? What's the risky option?
There's only one problem with this idea. We already know from my rigorous post-it study that people are always going to choose the middle option.
Probably they are.
No, I like this idea a lot. And I hadn't thought of this, but no, actually, I really do like this idea. And I think you're both exactly right. I think, Susan, people don't think about taking risk. And I do wonder if those of us who have chosen to be consultants, though it has its own challenges, I'm not saying we're amazing risk takers, but maybe we think about it a little differently, because I have encountered situations where I've been surprised at some of the decisions that have been made, that my clients have made. And if I expressed a different idea, sometimes it's very well received. Sometimes I get a litany of reasons why that couldn't possibly be done. Right. And I'm sure I've had this.
Well, and Guthrie, I'm also thinking about situations. I mean, we have one client in particular I'm thinking of where the object is to decrease risk, not increase risk. Could you flip this idea on its head, or do you have to do something different if what you were trying to do is decrease risk?
Well, that's a different because that's a corporate risk, which is like, what is the risk that like something will break?
Yeah.
Or someone will do something out of
protocol. Make an error. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a little different. I think we're just talking about stepping outside of your comfort zone.
Yes. Okay.
And
that is different than.
So, but think about it, right? You're in a meeting, and because you have to. What you're trying to do is you're trying to structure a company so that when you're in that Tuesday morning meeting that everyone loves, the 10:30 morning everyone gets together meeting, and someone says, hey, I think we're doing our online portal completely wrong, and I don't think we've done a good job with it, and I think it should be changed to this new thing that no one else is doing. What you want is for everyone in the room to like stand up and give like a standing ovation. Right? Like that would be the ideal outcome. Like, wow, yes. Thank you for saying this. And like, just like that would be the example of a positive reaction, and that positive feedback of going outside the comfort zone and saying risky things. Of course that never happens, because if you said that, like, everyone would look nervously around.
Right.
And then, maybe one of the execs would probably step up and say, okay, well, that's a good point. Like, let's work on that, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But like, there's tension in the room if someone says, I think we've done everything wrong, instead of pure joy, and admiration. So how can you get from awkward to standing O? I mean, you'd have to plan, and that's where your choice architecture to incentivize people to think about things differently would come in.
One thing I've wondered about, it's a concept that I hadn't seen very well, that I came up with when I was working on my blog, is what I just refer to as micro decisions, just as a way of basically empowering employees to say, we're going to give you complete, authority, latitude to make decisions within a certain space. And if they're meaningful decisions, then, and the person feels that they have some, yes, accountability, but also some authority. I've seen that work, in occasionally. And I've wondered if, and I just use micro decisions to kind of refer to the scope, right? So you're not making a decision about, $100 million budget. You're making decisions about, are we going to pursue this small project, or are we going to do this particular research in this way? But then give that person more latitude, because not surprisingly, when people are truly engaged and feel that they have some authority and they're being listened to, then they feel that they want to be more accountable, and that can, I think, contribute to a sense of psychological safety, which might be one small way, possibly, Guthrie, I'm not sure, to get to the standing ovation, which I love that idea. I really do. You would have to, I think, have a variety of techniques. And I really like your one about pay. I think that, you have to take risks. And if your manager is going to get, some kind of raise or bonus, he or she has to encourage the team to, you guys have to do it. He's got to basically, really persuade everyone on his team to take risks. I like that a lot, because now you've made the manager accountable, which is right. You were saying not just the individuals, but the manager.
Or imagine a universe where, so if you wanted to, for example, empower someone, to make their own decisions. Okay, imagine a universe in which everyone received praise. Like what's the definition of a project well done? And what if it was, don't ask your boss for approval? If you just do it yourself, that's a good job. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. The only thing that matters is that you were able to do the whole project and make all the decisions. And if you did that, awesome. And you get the
really
pay
interesting.
raise, you get your name on the gold star by your name, that kind of stuff. Because and you have to change how people are judging you, because right now it's all based on I guess performance of something. Basically, it's, did you make your boss look good? If you made your boss look good, then you win, and you get the praise, and everyone's like, great job. And if you didn't, then if you made your boss look bad, then you're like in the doghouse. And that's like not fostering. But so you just have to, change the incentives. And I mean, there's the financial incentives and then the social incentives.
Yes. That's great.
Yeah,
that's really well thought out. I think that those are really interesting ideas.
All right. Well, I'm going to interrupt because our hour is up, and we could keep going for a long time because I know this group.
Did you have any other questions?
Did I have any other questions?
Or did anyone?
I have lots, but I
this is a
think
great
we're
way to
going to have
end,
to do
though.
part 2 or part 3.
Good.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation, and we kind of wove in and out of an outline, didn't we?
But that's okay. That's
all right. Good combination of risk-taking, psychological safety, and control freakness.
And,
I guess so.
And choice architecture. Let's close on that.
And choice architecture? Okay.
Choice architecture. Now we sound like the Harvard professors, right?
Eric, I know that you have, I'm going to be posting when we post the podcast, I'll write a blog post about it. And because you have lots of ideas about articles and books and and so on.
What do you have
Great
to plug?
Suggestions. Anything in particular you want to add? What of your stuff should we plug?
Well, I did put some of my blog posts on the list, and the reason I put those on there is they were directly relevant to what we're talking about. And one of them, I call it How to Design for Brain Quirks, has gotten actually a good bit of traffic of my blog post. That's been the most heavily visited over the period of the last.
All right. So if we wanted to find your blog, and if we want to find you, what's the best way to get in touch with you and read your blog?
So if you go to uiuxtraining.com, that's the
Is that
homepage.
just all one word, so to speak?
Yep.
uiuxtraining.com.
And it's I have a homepage, and then there's a link to my blog.
Okay.
So it's right there, and then people can read that, and I would love it, and I would love it if people feedback or contact me about the training that we offer around UX research and design decisions, how design science can help you make better design decisions.
And you have an email there at the website that they can contact you at? Okay. Eric, thanks so much for coming on our podcast.
Well, thank you guys. It was a lot of fun.
And do you feel psychologically safe?
I do.
Okay, just checking. But not too safe.
Not too safe, because I have to take risks.
All right, good. That's good. All right. Thanks. Thanks, Guthrie.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.